Let's take a look at Peter Bruegel the Elder's depiction of the Tower of Babel. If you would wish to see this painting in real life, you would need to go to the Kunsthistorisches Museum, the Museum of Art History in Vienna, Austria. Or if you would like to see a particularly lovely framed print of it, you can visit my parents' dining room on 11th and Balboa in San Francisco. I grew up with this picture on the wall, and since we had the pleasure of hearing this today, these few verses that describe the Tower of Babel, I thought we would take a little art tour of this famous rendition of it. It's probably familiar to many of you. Cantor Andy described it to me as a sort of medieval Where's Waldo, where the more we look at it, the more detail we find. I'll give you a hint, Waldo isn't in it, but there's a lot of other wonderful details, and we'll zero in on a few of them in just a moment. We won't obviously get to all of them. That would take all day, and invite you to take your own tour of it. We know very little about the Flemish master, Peter Bruegel. He lived, we think, from the year 1525 to the year 1569. We actually do have scant details of his life, but in this famous rendering of the Tower of Babel, obviously the tower is where our eye goes first, this unfinished fortress right on the edge of the water. And since Peter lived in Antwerp, he would have been thinking of a city right along the water, a diverse and teeming city, probably with many, many languages, particularly at its height in the 1500s. But in contrast, behind the painting, we see elements of nature stretching far as the eye can see, fields, valleys, forests, meadows, watercourses. It's a panorama of Earth's wonders, and we appreciate, if we let our eye look beyond, the beauty of God's creation as opposed to the gigantic yet really futile work of man. In this close-up, we see the edge of the tower and nature stretching far, far, far into the distance. So there's a tremendous sense of scale and comparison in this. Bringing our focus back to the very foreground of the painting, this famous image at the bottom left shows King Nimrod coming to see the progress of the building. And here he comes with his guards and architects, and the stonemasons pay tribute, which is one way to describe it. It really looks rather like they're groveling and even suffering under the hand of the guards if you look over to the left. Let's give that a second to look. Let's pause here a little bit about King Nimrod. He is not named as the architect of the Tower of Babel, but it is an old legend, particularly put together by the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was a Roman collaborator. He combined stories to create the accepted legend of King Nimrod as the one who built the tower. Now, who was King Nimrod, you might ask? Well, we're not entirely sure at all. In the section before Rabbi Reuben began to read in Genesis 10, verse 10, we meet, actually verse 8, going back a little further. In verse 8, we meet Cush begot Nimrod. Nimrod was the first to be a mighty man on earth. It's not the easiest verse to translate, but it more or less translates to Nimrod as the first mighty man or the first warrior man on earth. Torah goes on to say he was a mighty hunter before God. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before God. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land Ashur went forth and built Nineveh, Rehavot Ir, Calah, Rezin, Nineveh, Calah, that is the great city. It's a few verses that detour from the genealogy at that point and gave rise to the legend of Nimrod as king of Babel. Also, the connection of the name of the place Shinar, which appears at the beginning of the story of Babel as well. And it came to pass when they migrated from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. So that overlap of Babel and Shinar gave rise to the Nimrod legend. The jury is still out on whether Nimrod was an evil king, as much of the traditional Jewish commentary suggests, or simply a mighty warrior king of the very early times. There is one suggestion that his tower was built, depending on the rendition, as a straight arrow, rather like a bow against the arrow, or sort of an arrow against the bow that is the rainbow earlier in the story here. It's not exactly clear. It's a sort of a mixed visual, but the idea that Nimrod perhaps was answering God's rainbow with this sort of straight arrow of his own with the tower. But some see that also as a rebellious gesture. And so the thought is that since he was a mighty warrior before God, that he was one who was going to do battle with God, to take on God and establish himself as a God. So there are some countless ways of reading a number of this story, but King Nimrod features in a lot of the versions of the Tower of Babel, whether it's stated explicitly in Genesis 11 or not. Let's take a little closer look at Nimrod, the way that Peter Bruegel would have seen him. So he puts King Nimrod here in Renaissance dress, and that's juxtaposed with Philip II of Spain here on the right in a painting by Titian. And King Philip II of Spain was ruling the Netherlands at the time of Bruegel. So Bruegel would have imagined his ancient biblical king, this ancient biblical king, perhaps Nimrod, in the style of the king that was ruling over the Netherlands at that time. Not a large stretch to paint King Nimrod in Renaissance dress. If you look at a couple of other closer pieces, over and over again, we see the bustle and movement going on around the tower, masons of all kinds, particularly stone masons, and really wonderful construction machines. This would have represented the craftspeople in the 1500s. We'll take a look at a couple more. And in some of the painting close-ups, you can see the dwellings that presumably the workers lived in at least part-time, if not full-time, as they worked on the tower, likely for years on end. So at various points along the way in a close-up of this painting, we get a sense of the humanity behind this enormous project. And certainly in our times, we're thinking about infrastructure and how crucial it is to have a functioning infrastructure in this or any country. The scale is impressive of this painting. There seems to be no end to it. Up at the top of the painting, the tower penetrates the clouds, but it ultimately goes nowhere. It is entirely possible that Bruegel was using the Roman Colosseum, most assuredly, as a model for the tower that he saw in his painting. Of course, the Colosseum has been crumbling, now in a state of arrested decay, but certainly had been crumbling for centuries by Bruegel's time. And of course, in his painting, we're not quite sure if the Tower of Babel is going up, most likely, or kind of seeming to be coming down. At any rate, it appears to be sort of falling apart in the center. Let's take one more look at the whole painting. Right. Going up or coming down. Now, it is true that when it comes to art, we very much often see what we want to see. And in looking close up and far away at this painting, I guess you can tell what school I'm from, because to me, and it's very much a Rorschach test, I highly doubt that Bruegel meant this, but for me, right down in the center, we'll close up on it in a second, but take a look down at the absolute center where the tower seems to be kind of breaking open. To me, I see there a figure of a Moses striding out, maybe from a Mount Sinai kind of place, holding up over his shoulder a shape, to me, of the Ten Commandments. At this point, I can't see it another way, largely because that's really the way I want to see it. But I see a Moses-type figure coming out of the rubble, reminding us what is ultimately most important in our world. We do build edifices to the stars, but ultimately it is keeping our feet on the ground, even as we reach to heaven, that will guide us along our path. Take a look at that Moses, see if you can see him. See the shape of the Ten Commandments up over his shoulder, that sort of white tablet-like shape? Suddenly, after all these years of looking at that print, Moses came walking right out of it to me. And that's the beauty of art. We can see in it what we'd like to. We certainly do build towers to the heavens. Let's take a look at a couple of Babel towers, perhaps in our own time. This is what's known as the Taipei 101. It was the tallest building in the world until another one came to take its place. Let's take a look at the next one. This is now the tallest building in the world. Who knows how long that will last? This is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, currently the world's tallest building, kind of extraordinary looking actually. And of course, closer to home, not quite the tallest building in the world by any means, but certainly dominating our own landscape in San Francisco is our now, over all else, the Salesforce Tower in downtown San Francisco. Boy, is that visible from almost anywhere in the city. So we build these towers to God, but we never quite get there because it's not possible to do. And in the end, it is the towers and fortresses and palaces that we build in our own soul that ultimately do bridge the divide between the earthly and the heavenly, between the body and the spirit, between the human being and the divine. Let us build projects for good. Taking from that first verse from today's reading, when all people, very briefly, had one language and one common purpose. Now, I am a great champion, I hope, of diversity and an appreciator of languages. I don't really think that's ultimately what the Torah means. The Torah is inviting us to be united in purpose for a common good. And when we are that way, to not give in to temptation as those did at the building of the Tower of Babel, a tower to God that could never be completed. How about we turn our attention to projects that are good for the economy and good for our society, a strong infrastructure that's not only of roads and bridges and enormous buildings, but an infrastructure that builds character, true unity, purpose, and celebrates the worth and dignity of every human being. Thank you, my friends. Shabbat Shalom.